right, let's call to order day 2, Yamhill County Budget Committee.
And if I may, Chair, just before we start the presentations with the criminal justice team, I have some handouts, just really quick, because I know during the discussions about economic development and there were questions about the scope of work for what said core provides. What I did is I took out the contract. It's a 75-page document with a couple updates, so I just pulled the scope of work portion of it, the attachment.
Good idea, thank you.
That provides the list of services that said core provides under the agreement with the county. And I know there were questions on this yesterday, so I just wanted to grab that, so hopefully you'll find it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
All right, so sorry for the interruption, Brad, but now it's our district attorney, Brad Berry, will present his items.
This is all new territory for me. For Commissioner Starrett, I'm gonna hold this up.
Aww.
So, but she's home, she's working from home this week. Along with everybody else. But good morning, good morning to the new budget. Excuse me a second. Turn my phone on. I'm going to start with just kind of some general comments like usual, and then pointing out a couple of things in each of these two budgets, and of course answer any questions that you have. It's been a pretty interesting year for us so far. We continue to have pending more homicide cases than really we have since I've been DA. So over the last 2 years, we've really been inundated with homicide cases. As you know, the Vineyard case just resolved after many days of hearings on that, resolved in really a way that was unfortunate for everybody involved, in my humble opinion. But we have other homicides still pending, and we'll continue to work on those. I'll mention in a moment why that's important. The shutdown has been interesting for us. Law enforcement has been directed to only cite to appear most individuals, so we're not getting custody arrests, at least very many of those. As you'll hear from the sheriff, the jail population has been reduced down to, I want to say about 40%, maybe 30% of what is normal, to hopefully avoid having the virus get into the facility and affect staff as well as those who are in custody. Crime continues though. I can't tell you that we have seen it locally, but the statistics I'm hearing from around the state as well as around the country, it's domestic violence is up. We have seen burglaries, commercial burglaries are up. In fact, McMinnville has created a task force to specifically deal with the increase in commercial burglaries. And that really shouldn't surprise anyone. You have all these facilities, all these buildings, all these businesses sitting empty every day. So it's really no surprise. I will tell you my one concern on all of this is what will happen when they turn the lights back on. We will get an influx of cases. It's happened to us once before. I don't think anybody in the room would probably recall it, but back in around 2008, plus or minus a year or two, the state ran out of money for funding indigent defense. And for a period of 3 months towards the end of the fiscal year, they quit funding that, and all those cases sat until July 1 when the funding came available. And then we suddenly had an influx of all these cases that were on the docket that we had to deal with all at once. I'm anticipating something similar to that again when they turn the lights on here. And I only mention that because we will have some interesting times in trying to keep up with all of that when that happens. All right, well, having said that, let me get to the 1018 budget. I'll look at the page number for you. It starts on page 59 of your budget book. There are, you will see in the budget, there are no changes in FTE for the 1018 budget. We did receive another 2-year grant for one of the DDA positions through the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. That's, you'll see budgeted in the revenue line item of state enhancement. And that's a 2-year, we are in year 1 of the 2-year grant. And this is year 3 of the position, as we in the past had a prior 2-year grant on it, which was essentially renewed. It was not renewed at full budget, but it was renewed at probably, I'm looking across at my office manager, about 80%, if I remember correctly, on that. Just a couple of notes on the various things. You'll note under trials and appeals, now down in expenses, I think it's 695.03, that I am under budgeted there. I just don't know how much. I've shared with the commissioners in the past that when we have these homicide cases, they involve great expense. So for example, in the Vineyard case, when we had to have him psychologically evaluated for the purposes of GEI, guilty except insanity, that cost us over $30,000 for that particular expert. And that was before then the legislature gutted Measure 11 for youth and ended up back in juvenile court. And we ended up with different evaluations once he was back in juvenile court for different issues. But my point being that when we get these homicide cases, that it's not uncommon to have an insanity defense or a diminished mental capacity defense that's put on us, and that involves significant expert testimony and significant expense for us. Again, I know I'm under budgeted there, but it would just be a total wag for me to put a bigger number in, not knowing what will happen over the next 12 months, actually the next fiscal year. The other thing I wanted to point out, as I try to show you things that are anomalies, is under capital. You'll note that typically in the past, we have not made much expenditure out of our capital lines. I have increased those significantly. We were approved for a remodel by the commissioners last year, which hasn't done yet, but I know I'm going to have capital expenditures, for example, a different cubicle set up for the administrative staff, and we'll probably have some changes involved with the lawyer offices also. So I've tried to budget for that this year rather than having to come back to the commissioners mid-year asking for funds to do that. Otherwise, the big nut in our budget is personnel, about 90% of our budget, and FTE remain the same. So those are kind of the highlights of the 1018, my notes on the 1018 budget, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that you might have. All right, I will move on to the 1022 budget. So on this one, I want to share, because I know we have a couple of new budget committee members. The 1022 budget, which begins on page
62.
62. This is the child support program, and this program is responsible for collection of child support for Yamhill County families. It is really one of the few areas that the District Attorney's Office is proactive by helping the financial security of families and children. Much of what we do is reactive. Somebody gets arrested, somebody commits a crime, and we respond. But this is one where our collection of over $5 million a year for Yamhill County families really aids them in being secure and in being successful. For the new budget committee members, I just want to go through a little bit about how this is funded, because there's an add back, a request for additional funding here, and you need to kind of understand how this works. You'll see under revenue, it says child support enforcement. What that is federal money, which essentially reimburses us for 2/3 of the expenses for running the program. It's a direct dollar for dollar equation. So if we spend $3, the feds pay us back $2, and the county is only responsible for $1. So the county then has essentially a 1/3 match. Each dollar spent by the county equals $3 in total available revenue. Additionally, we receive incentive funds. This is a national program. So the Fed set up benchmarks or goals. The states that are involved in child support collection, when they meet those goals, are given incentive monies. And then the incentive monies coming to the state are shared proportionately through the state offices as well as the county offices. We cannot use the federal incentive monies for match. We used to be able to, which really, if you think about it, the feds were allowing us to use federal money to match other federal monies. And they discontinued that, I want to say back in the Bush administration. So it's been a while since we've been able to do that. And of note in this budget, in the fiscal year 1920, the one that we're currently in, the commissioners approved and funded a manager position. That was done recently, and as yet, primarily because of the shutdown, we have not filled that position. Consequently, you're going to see that this budget has an additional FTE over the 1920 approved budget. However, the FTE has previously been approved this year by the commissioners. My calculations, and I say mine because it was this office is doing, we significantly missed on the ending fund balance for fiscal year for the fiscal year 18-19, which then impacted our beginning fund balance for 19-20. That I addressed that with the commissioners several months ago. It was backfilled to get us to the end of the year. But the point being, it basically gets us to the end of the year with a zero, should be close to a zero fund balance. And consequently, we have no beginning fund balance to budget into 2021. I submitted a budget pursuant to Ken's directions that was not balanced for this year. And we will need an additional $74,468 of county general fund in order for the budget to balance. Now, I need to point out, just as a reminder, that the county's additional funding of the just under 75,000 actually means an additional revenue to the department, to this budget, of $223,000, because we get $2 of federal money for every dollar that the county puts in. So that additional investment is tripled by the time we get to actual expenses for the 1022 budget.
And Brad,
Yes, sir.
If I could just interrupt really quickly, I just want to make sure, just for point of clarification for the record, the current 1022 budget that's built in here, that's in this proposed budget, is balanced. Even though it's on your deliberation list for Wednesday on the add back request for the 74,000, this budget is being presented to the budget committee with that change already built into the budget. I just want to be clear that under Oregon budget law, I have to present a balanced budget to the committee. So we went ahead and made the change, and so balanced to 1002 with that additional discretionary amount. So this budget reflects what is being requested as a balanced budget. So I just want to clarify that. Thanks, Brad.
Thank you. Thank you. And I should point out, as you look at where each dollar should go, which obviously is your job, if we're $75,000 short in a particular budget, we would have to cut 3 times in this budget. We would have to cut 3 times that amount in order to save $75,000. Does that make sense to everybody?
Sure does.
So the Fed's paying 2/3 of all of our expenses. We have to cut $3 to save $1 of county contribution. It's a very difficult budget to work with when we have to cut on it, because the amounts are so huge in trying to save $1 of county funds. I can try to explain that. I'm guessing that I know the commissioners have dealt with this with me year after year, but if the budget committee members have questions about that, I can explain it further.
No questions.
I have just one question. This is Rick. I'm the new member. Mr. Barry.
Good morning.
Morning.
It's Brad, but thank you.
I got confused because we were talking about
Say, Mr. Day.
Mr. Bradbury. In terms of activity, is the amount of collections, the activity, the numbers, has it been increasing? Is it steady? Can you just give us a little brief synopsis of the activity level in Yamhill
In
County?
child
Yeah,
child
in
support
enforcement,
collections?
yeah.
The child support collections, I think, to be fair, over the last year have probably dropped. And that's because of the implementation of a new computer system at the state level that they refer to as Origin. So we literally had, we probably had 6 weeks of training where there were no collections going on. Actually, it was longer than that. It was about 2 months, wasn't it, Deb? I think they stopped collections for about a 2-month period while they did training around the state. And we were given directives from the state to discontinue the activities we would normally do. So if you look over the collections for the last year, they're going to be down. That is because we were shorthanded for a period of time, primarily because of how slow the rollout was on the new computer system and directives to have no collection. Money kept coming in, but no collection efforts for a period of time. For the most part, though, we have been, if we step back and look, we've been collecting between 5 and probably 6.5 million a year routinely over the last 5 years.
Thank you.
No other questions?
No questions from me, Brad.
None for me.
No, thank you.
Okay, well, on behalf of my office and we will sign off. Thank you for your time, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Deb.
Bye-bye.
I feel like we should see your fingernails, baby.
Is the sheriff or Jessica, is she just gonna join us at one or is it a separate telephone?
This one should be one, Jessica always did good, she does a good job, she too.
There's Justice.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Morning.
Morning.
Yes.
Yes. All right, so next up, this is Jessica Beach. She's the Director for Department of Community Justice. And her budget, I know she has several supplemental materials that she's added in here. The actual budget starts on page 64, but Jessica, were you planning on going through your attachments?
I actually was going to do a little bit something different this year with some new budget committee members. I'll
Great.
talk just a little bit at first about what community corrections does,
All
how we
right,
do it.
all right, you're up.
All right, well, thank you. Good morning to the Budget Committee and the Board of Commissioners and Administration. Before I begin, Ken already introduced me. I'm Jessica Beach, the Director of Yamhill County Community Justice. Before I move on, I wanted to let you know there are a couple of my managers here in the room with me. My Finance Manager, Vicki Wood, my Detention Manager, Scott Posh, and my Juvenile Probation Manager, Dana Corelli, and my Adult Corrections Manager, Larry Evanson. And Brian is watching us from YouTube. So with that being said, wanted to do something a little different and explain a little bit about who we are and what we do. Community Justice oversees an Adult Probation Division, a Juvenile Probation Division, a 24-bed youth detention facility, adult pretrial services, and parks and crew. The main goal of community corrections is to assist with cognitive and behavioral change of both adult and juvenile justice involved individuals through community supervision, program and service referral to ensure long-term pro-social change. I wanted to share with you our mission statement. It is fairly new to us. Our mission is to serve the community with compassion while promoting accountability, safety, and wellness to inspire positive, lasting change. I'm really proud of that. That was something that was a session that was facilitated with my staff and developed in collaboration in the summer of 2019. And I think if you compare it to a previous mission statement from about 15 years ago, it really does speak to the vast improvements and culture change that has been made in community corrections across the state. It's very common now when a PO is working with somebody, it may be the first time that justice involved individuals actually met somebody that engages with them, that shares their successes, but also holds them accountable. And it's really not surprisingly to receive letters or updates from these folks once they expire, telling us about their successes, which is really a vastly different culture than when I started my job over 20 years ago. So we make these successes achievable through the implementation of evidence-based practices. These are science-driven techniques that are directly correlated, with the reduction in recidivism. So a couple of those are examples. We use static and dynamic risk assessment tools, which measure both recidivism, meaning risk to reoffend, but also directly tells us information about somebody's particular needs on an individual case basis. We also develop case plans in collaboration with our clients, which really provides a roadmap to what needs and how best to address that person's supervision plan. We have the ability to impose both sanctions and incentives to address certainly keeping folks accountable when there's a violation of supervision, but also providing incentives when we see behavior that we like and that we want to continue. We have various programs and services that we refer to, basic needs such as housing, hygiene, medical, employment, as well as treatment services, mental health, drug and alcohol, dual diagnosis. Our officers utilize various interview techniques that, such as motivational interviewing. Our juvenile department, for instance, has implemented something called coaching options that are versatile and active, which better engages our youth directly in their supervision plan. Just briefly want to talk a little bit about our operations during COVID, and in the interest of Governor Brown's executive order, as well as the safety of the community and the staff members. Our doors do remain closed currently to the public, but business continues. I'm pleased to say that the majority of my staff, and then detention staff, of course, are telecommuting on a rotational basis, but we do have a skeleton crew and social distance here in the office, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. We have suspended all face-to-face contacts, field contacts, and waste submissions, but we've increased our contacts telephonically and via virtual means with our clients. And we are considering some potential ways to continue our field contacts safely in the field, social distancing, of course, but would allow us to provide some community presence and additional support for justice involved individuals. I wanted to mention as well, before beginning, I'm sure most of you are aware, the governor is asking all state agencies to undergo a 8.5% budget reduction exercise. And this does account for every single state agency. And I mention that to you because as we go through the budget, you'll quickly see that 94% of my adult budget is supported by state funds. And 26% of my juvenile probation budget is supported by state funds. So should this exercise occur, there will be significant impact. And since this potential 8.5 cut applies to the 2019-21 biennium, this actually means 17% budget cut in one fiscal year. So I will be honest with you when I say, should this come to fruition, there will be significant cuts to make in my department, unfortunately. This exercise is due to the governor on this coming Friday, May 8th.
Jessica,
Yes.
we have a question.
Hi, Jessica, it's Lindsay. Can you repeat that last statement when you said it's almost retroactive to 1920? Is that what you said? So total, it's a
Yeah, so I understand that the 8.5% budget cut would apply to the 2019-21 biennium. And because of that,
Oh,
it
biennium,
wouldn't
okay.
actually take effect until this coming fiscal year. So really what that means is will be a 17% cut in one fiscal year.
Okay, thank you.
2020-21.
Jessica, I have a question for you. Do any of those programs, if the governor or the state implements that 8.5% cut, do any of those programs fall under that, if they fall below the threshold level, that you can give them back to the state and say, you run them now, we're not gonna run them anymore?
AKA opt out.
Commissioner, the audio broke up.
I can't hear you.
Feels like the best trick ever.
My question was just, is with that 8.5% cut, do any of our programs qualify for the opt-out that we can give them back to the state?
That is a great question. There is a lot of indecision about whether or not that would be the case. I have been in contact with our county council, and I know there's been some discussion with AOC about what the potential of that would be. Unfortunately, the statute is just so unclear, but I will tell you there are a lot of discussions about what that might look like statewide should the governor choose to cuts.
Okay, thanks, Jessica.
One more question.
Absolutely.
Jessica, one more question, just to piggyback on Commissioner Olson's question. So would that mean staff cuts at our level?
I am still trying to figure out exactly what that would mean for us locally, but I will say that very possibly we would actually have to make cuts that deep.
And just for the benefit, because I know there are some of us in the room that are familiar with the opt-out
Yeah.
and others who may not be, there's provisions in statute that if funding levels drop, and I don't remember the percentage or the numbers off the top of my head, but there's a baseline of funding for community corrections for their agreements. And if the funding levels drop below that baseline, it allows counties that to essentially opt out of providing the service, and parole and probation would be turned back over to the state to do.
Except in our case, misdemeanors wouldn't.
Except for
because-
misdemeanors.
Yeah, so I think that's a
Not
good
only
clarification.
Felony supervised, because the state doesn't pay for supervised misdemeanors. I think there's only been 2 counties in recent time that have opted out. Douglas County and Lynn County opted out a number of years ago. But again, it's a county decision. But I don't think there's a lot of clarity on whether or not these reductions put us into an opt-out situation. I know Christian, through his circles, has been monitoring. I've also been, listening for things from the other administrators. I know Jessica's monitoring as well. So.
We can do that. States can do that for public health as well. I think Wallowa County has opted out. There are a number of them just because they don't have the funding.
All right.
Thank you for the questions, great questions. So unfortunately, the potential budget cuts come at a particularly difficult time, as Kim was talking about the opt-out. The Department of Corrections is statutorily required to complete an actual cost study every 6 years, which is intended to make sure that community corrections is fully funded, as you mentioned. The actual cost study was completed in 2018 and actually represented an increase of $50 million. To community corrections, which ultimately the legislators decided not to allocate. In fact, did not provide any type of increase. So at that time, there was some discussion about opt-out. So unfortunately, then considering this 8.5% or technically 17% in one fiscal year is a bit difficult to swallow, certainly. I should also mention to you that the Criminal Justice Commission is a state agency, and they provide us with justice reinvestment funds. They are also undergoing the same exercise, but are unsure exactly how that would look. They're working on that as well. On a quick note, the Criminal Justice Commission is and has submitted an application for COVID-19 supplemental emergency funding, and so I'm certainly hoping that that will be awarded. at which time they're not sure exactly how the allocations will go out to all 36 counties. But I'm just delighted that they have made the effort to make that submission for potential assistance. So finally, before we get into the presentation, I did want to mention that none of these cuts that I've mentioned were included in this budget just because it is just an exercise and may not come to fruition. And I do also want to mention that as we go through this, you know, we did the best we can to consider our revenue, but we don't incorporate potential revenue losses that we may experience because of COVID. So we did the best we could at this point, but we could see some changes. We're just being very, very careful moving forward with that. So with that, moving on to the budget presentation, I did want to mention to you the two handouts that Ken had mentioned. The first one is that I will direct your attention to is that it's entitled Community Corrections State Revenue Projection. And this is just really, this is helpful to me anyway. Hopefully it's helpful to you. You see in the top left corner there, the allocation of the statewide Department of Corrections funds is 2.42. And that changes every 2 years or every biennium based on a snapshot and a capitated formula rate that they determine. But basically it's based on our population here in Yamhill County. So it has fluctuated. We did see a bit of an increase this biennium, so that's good. To the top of the right, you'll see the total funding for one fiscal year that is granted from Department of Corrections to community justice. And then you'll see there are two arrows pointing down to grant aid, which is just general felony supervision allotment. And then a significant portion, 34.5% of that budget, then goes to support Senate Bill 1145. And what this is this was a Senate bill that was passed in the 90s that basically allowed Department of Corrections inmates to serve a sentence of a year or less in their local jail. So it saved a lot of prison beds, certainly, and allowed those folks to complete their sentences locally. So then below that, Senate Bill 1145, you then see that's divided as well into jail-related costs to incarcerate and provide services to these folks while they serve their sentences locally. And then you also see to the right community corrections related, so for case planning, transition planning, those type of activities. So I just wanted to share that with you. So technically, of my entire budget, approximately 4.5% actually goes to these 1145 folks. Any questions on that? Okay, the other handout that you have there entitled Yamhill County Department of Community Justice Budget Overview basically lists out for you each of the budgets that we're going to go through, and it explains what the intent is, what they support, and also how they're funded. So I just feel free to use that if that's helpful to you as we go through the budget. And with that, I will begin you on page 64. And we'll begin with Fund 21, which is the Adult Community Justice Budget. And you see there on line 30101, our proposed beginning balance of 1.13. And then moving on to the next page, and what I'll do is I'll go through and really I'm just going to highlight for you changes. And if you have any questions, feel free to jump in and I'll explain as best I can. So this is our 2141 budget. So this is our Department of Corrections grant aid funds that goes to support those Senate Bill 1145 folks that are incarcerated locally in our local corrections facility. So starting there, you'll see our beginning balance on 30154. And then the next line down on 33467, that's where you see our Department of Corrections allotment. There's several footnotes there, but I think it'll make a little bit more sense when I get down to materials and services to talk about those changes. So currently this budget supports 3 of the highest paid deputies in the jail. And we work with the sheriff on this budget. so that it certainly meets his needs. That hasn't changed, so no change in personnel. And moving down to materials and services, I'll go ahead and talk about that change. So in 78001, originally there was a transfer that was made to a county fund to provide maintenance. And instead, the decision was made to transfer those funds two levels down in 78045 and 78056. Which is a transfer to jail maintenance as well as to jail capital. And I think this probably better reflects that this money will be utilized for maintenance of jail as opposed to just county buildings and property. So that change made sense. Any questions on that?
Jessica, maybe you can talk about, I don't know, I know right now numbers in the jail are down, but what's your average population for 1145 inmates?
Great question. So normally I want to say we fluctuate between 30 to 35. And I can only imagine it is very, very low at this point. I haven't actually looked at the numbers, but based on the general population, I bet it's maybe 5 or 7 at this point, is my best guess. And then move down to 99003, you see the reserve for future. So this is funds that are not touched but held over for the next year for support of this personnel. And as you can see, there is a significant difference between the adopted budget from last year versus this year. So certainly some changes will have to be made in the following fiscal year. Any questions on 2141?
And I'll just add for the committee that the funds that are being transferred to this account, to the jail maintenance and jail capital, will make more sense when the sheriff presents his budget and we get into Fund 40, which is the capital reserve. We can show you where these monies are landing and what they're being. All right.
Excellent. Moving on to page 66. Sorry, later, summary. Okay, moving on to page 66. This is Fund 2144. And this is a fund that supports supervision of misdemeanor folks. This is our only county general fund allocation. And I want to point this out to you because we are very fortunate that the Board of Commissioners continues to make misdemeanor supervision important. Some counties sadly had to make the decision to terminate misdemeanor supervision completely. And I will just add that misdemeanors do make up person-to-person crimes such as
Cut out, Jessica.
support and supervise that population.
Jessica, you froze up there for a second.
She might even be talking still.
Those in this budget, so we don't have any changes there to personnel.
All right, hey Jessica, we missed that entire presentation because your video froze up.
From misdemeanors, make a
From
large portion of
misdemeanors. Yeah,
person to person.
and you froze up.
I was just giving you total accolades. So yes, I was just saying that we're very fortunate in Yamhill County that the Board of Commissioners continues to make misdemeanor supervision a priority because as you may know, misdemeanors do include person-to-person crimes such as some domestic violence, some sexual offenses, as well as DUIs. So certainly I consider that to be a population that we would like to continue to supervise. Did that hit it?
Yes. Thank you.
Excellent. Did you hear me talking about personnel?
No.
No.
Okay, so Great, so moving down into personnel, historically, we've supported our two lowest paid CO positions in this budget, and there's been no change there. So no changes to personnel. And as I move down to materials and services, I don't really see any huge changes unless there are questions from the budget committee. Like I said, that's my easiest budget usually. Okay, so then moving on to page 68. This is Fund 2145. This department supports probation officers assigned to supervise felony justice-involved individuals on probation, parole, and post-prison supervision. This also includes management, administrative support, and pretrial services and treatment services. And I should mention the pretrial services are specifically supported by Justice Reinvestment Grants, since I cannot utilize Department of Corrections grant aid to support pretrial supervision and programs. So starting here in 33413, you will see there our Department of Corrections grant aid allotment. This is the number that should be 8.5 or the 17% budget decrease come to fruition. These are the numbers that are going to be greatly affected. And no other real changes to mention in regard to revenue unless there's questions. I should also mention again that there's no loss in revenue shown because of COVID here. We did our best to guess, but we do expect there to be some losses. Okay, moving down to personnel. So the first change I'll point out to you is on 40210 for probation officer aid. I also love to mention, whenever you see a 0.5, I always like to tell you where that other 0.5. So the other 0.5s here, or the other percentage of an FTE, you'll find in 2167, which is the last DILT budget that we'll get to. The one exception there is on line 40220, our office specialist tech. And her other FTE is actually in our juvenile probation budget of 1074. So the main change I want to talk about on 40210 is that we're actually adding an increase in FTE. This FTE was actually added in the 2019-20 budget and approved by the Board of Commissioners. But of course, this would certainly be a change from the last previously adopted budget. And then moving down into 40336, probation officer 2, you'll see a change there in FTE from 11.3 to 11.4. And really what this signifies is that we're making a change in caseload assignments between two POs. And so the workload change made this a better viable option. And then I don't believe I have anything else in personnel to show to you unless there are questions.
This is Rick. I have a question for you. What is the extra help line item 482.0? I'm just not familiar with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the extra, I'm hearing echoing. I think it's me though. So actually, that includes extra helps. For instance, my previous director worked on contract here, so that line is funding for that. It also provides funding for our part-time temporary interns that can work up to 19 hours per week. We currently have one of those, and we actually did add in a little bit more funds there than we did previously because we do have a potential retirement. And if that person retires, that person would be willing to contract back, similar to what Ted Santana, our previous director, did to assist with training in our transition.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Moving on to page 69. And really, I didn't have any significant changes to point out to you under materials and services, unless there were questions. Okay. Here then, move on to page 7. And no other changes to point out here until we get down to capital. If you go down to 880, we did include an increase this by 13,000 in order to purchase 2 field radios for our POs. Currently, McMinnville PD, Hoover PD, and the county, and the sheriff's office are undergoing an upgrade in the radio system from our old analog technology to digital technology. And it's very good technology, but it's very expensive. So we're purchasing these in phases, but this is a fourth purchase of 2. Any questions before moving on? Excellent. We're on page 71. And this is our 2163 budget, which supports work release. So it is supported by Department of Corrections grant and aid funds as well as work crew contracts. So beginning under revenue, I have to you 34203 work release. I want to give my Parks manager, Jared Watson, a kudos here that when he came in, he really worked on all our contracts to actually get us up to be charging what we actually should be charging. And so he's done some great efforts to be able to increase our revenues there. With that being said, currently, because we don't have the work crew to support those contracts, we're not able to collect on those contracts. So these numbers, as I mentioned several times now, do not include the potential revenue loss due to COVID. So moving down to still in revenue of lines 380, 03, and 380.6. Those are transfers that are made to fairgrounds that supports one of our work crew supervisors. And then this is fairly new for us, the public works as well. And there's a work crew supervisor there that this department supports. With that being said, moving down to personnel. So the main change here is in 40325. You'll see a change in FTE from 3 to 4. And this FTE was actually added in the 2020 budget and approved by the board. And this is with regards to that change that we made where this work crew supervisor actually works under public works. But it makes more sense to have all the work crew supervisors supervised by one manager. So Mark Lagos and Jared Logston have been working together to develop that plan. No other changes to personnel unless you have questions. And moving down to materials and services. I also didn't have any changes to point out to you there. Moving down to capital, to line 800.8. This allotment is intended to purchase 3 radios for our work crew supervisors, and the idea is they're out in the field with work crew, and sometimes they're so far out that they're county issued cell phones don't actually work, and we want to make sure that they have the ability to call for assistance should there be an issue with an inmate or a medical need or whatever the case may be. Any questions on 2163? All right, moving on to the last adult budget on page 73. And this is our Fund 2163. So this is the funding that I mentioned that supports Senate Bill 1145 case management. So we actually have a PO that works out of the jail and assists on transition planning and developing those local control board orders for us. 167. Apparently I said something different. So moving down to revenue, just pointing out our beginning balance on line 33467. Again, this number could significantly change if we were to expect those state cuts. And then moving down into personnel, here you see the 0.5s that I mentioned to you before, the other half of which are in 2145. The only change here I'll point out to you is 4036, probation officer 2. This is the other 0.7 and 0.6 that I mentioned to you in 2145 that indicates a change in personnel assignment workload. Moving down to materials and services. I really don't have any changes to point out to you unless there are questions. And we have nothing in capital. So, in finality, moving to page 75. And there in our ending balance, 99001, you'll see our ending balance of $510,000. Are there any questions on the adult budget before moving on to juvenile?
No, thank you.
All right, I will shift gears here a little bit and ask you to turn to page 76. If we can start with our budget 1074, which is our juvenile probation budget. But as I mentioned before, this budget is supported by approximately 74% county funds and approximately 26% state funds. So although we will experience some deficits, should the state decide to make a budget cut, it certainly wouldn't be as extensive as it would be to the adult. So first change we'll point out to you under revenue would be the first line, 30101 beginning balance. And I actually wanted to make a change here. You see there 285, but I'm suggesting that we change that to 265. And the reason is that we had a significant cost that we didn't expect to incur with regards to the vineyard case. As of January 1 of this year, there was a new law that came into effect, Senate Bill 1008, with some Measure 11 reforms. And so we had to complete psychological evaluations with regard to the waiver hearing. And so that was a great expense that we did not anticipate. And I'll talk about that a little bit later because we do now have that type of cost budgeted. Other than that, no other changes to mention. On line 33411, of course, you see the state funds, and that could be changed potentially. But no other changes to revenue. Moving down into personnel. The first position that I would point out to you is 40202, Office Specialist 2. This is a vacant position that's been vacant for some time. And due to this budget, I'm going to go ahead and cut that clerk position. So going from 1 to 0 FTE. And then moving down to 40224, Education Transition Specialist. This is a new FTE of 0.8 that was added in the 2019-20 budget due to an Oregon Department of Education grant. This supports a really unique position in that this person works in our juvenile probation department, specifically with schools, assisting folks that are in detention or folks that have educational needs and getting them those educational needs met. So we're really excited. That's a 3-year grant, and we certainly hope that the funding will be able to continue. Moving on to 40330, Juvenile Probation Officer 1. So I actually was going to point out, I believe there was a mistake with regard to last year's budgeted FTE. It actually says 2, but it actually was previously 1. But we are asking to increase that to 2. And we just have seen a number of changes recently, which makes this necessary to add an additional body. And then one last change in personnel down on 40349. And I think this is also a mistake under Deputy DA 2. Previously, that would have been a 2 for last year's budget. And we are proposing to change that to a 1. And just a little background with regard to this, back in 2016-17, that fiscal year, the director, Ted Spintana, had actually approached the Board of Commissioners and the Budget Committee to ask for an allotment to add a second DA. And at the time, based on workload, it was necessary. But we've seen a decrease in workload, but an increase in workload for the PO. So I am using or asking to use that allotment to use for that probation officer 1.
So, Director, the question I have, this is Casey. The question I have is, it doesn't really look in the previous year's budgets like there were 2 on that line. Is it just that it was, you started out wanting 2, but it was never budgeted for, and now you're going to 1 in the budget?
Are you referring to the juvenile PO or
Actually,
the DA?
I'm looking at 40349.
I can answer.
Okay, great.
Because if you look at the actuals, there were 2 DAs in the office. If you go back to 17-18 and 18-19, you'll see 1 deputy DA 1, you'll see an actual, and you'll see expense also for a DA 2. So there's 2 different levels of DA, so there were
That's
in
right.
fact 2.
Yeah, 1 and a 2. Yeah, I got it.
And a 2.
Okay, that makes sense. It was just split, so it was 1 and 1, yeah. Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions under personnel? Moving on to page 77, moving into materials and services. I will point out to you on line 61001, professional services. This is where we added some additional funds to cover those Senate Bill 1008 waiver hearings. And of course, it's very difficult to predict how many or how few we may have, that we certainly determined based on that bill that we received in the last for this fiscal year, that it was definitely something we needed to budget. So you do see an increase there from 5 to 27,000. And then moving down, I'll just point out to you on 99001, our ending balance for the juvenile department, 186,495. And are there any questions on 1074 before moving to detention? Actually, my apologies. Vicki pointed out, I did miss something. Going back to the end balance 99001, we do want to modify that just like we did with the beginning balance. So instead of reading 186, it would actually be 166,495. Okay. Okay, moving on to our last budget on page 78. And this is Fund 1077 that supports our juvenile detention. So I will just mention briefly that the primary revenue here is supported by the county or contracts that we have with other counties. Currently, there are 12 youth detention facilities in the state of Oregon. So For those counties that don't have them locally, they contract for beds as needed. And this is supported by approximately 1% state funds, so it's a very small proportion. So beginning on 30101, beginning balance, see there. The next line down is that very tiny amount of state funding that we receive for community service. Other than that, unless there's questions regarding revenue, we can move down to personnel.
I have a question. This is
Yeah.
Rick. I have a question for you, Jessica. Do you see any projections around the counties around the state of Oregon with any changes potentially for the revenue we receive for bed rental? Like in Polk County, and a lot of them are going to different statewide for the adult, like Norcor and everything. Do you see anything like that getting more competitive, or we won't be able to maintain that bed rental?
That's a great question, Commissioner. I certainly am in close contact with the director of Polk County because that Polk County bed rental contract does represent such a large portion of our revenue. I don't get that sense. Norcor is particularly unique in that it supports, how many? Actually supports 4 counties, but I haven't heard any discussion about a similar model elsewhere in Oregon.
Okay, thanks, Jessica.
Absolutely. Okay, moving down into personnel. So we actually don't have any changes in FTE that I need to share with you. I will point out in line 4820 extra help that we did make an increase there in 25,000. We have experienced some staffing issues lately. We had 2 folks that were on medical leave. We had one on FMLA and one in military leave, and they all kind of hit us at the same time. And so this line goes to support on-call folks that are necessary to maintain our 24/7 operations. Otherwise, I have nothing to point out to you with regard to personnel unless you have questions. Moving on to page 79. And only one thing to point out to you under materials and services on line 702. Extra resources. Previously, this was added in last year. We had a particular situation where we had 2 youth that had been arrested in a fairly serious crime, and they were co-defendants. And we saw this as a conflict of interest, and so we actually created a contract with Lynn Benton and actually housed one of the youth in that facility. But both of those scenarios have since been resolved, so we don't see that as a continued need. We did keep just a small amount in there should something similar happen, but we hadn't ever experienced something similar like that, and certainly hope that we don't in the future. And then moving down, nothing in capital. And then moving down to 99001, ending balance of 22,070. Any questions on Fund 1077?
So quick question, Director, this is Casey. So we are now putting, with that 56,000, now putting money into the jail capital. And it just struck me as interesting that we don't have anything going into a juvenile detention capital is there, like, what's the state? I mean, I've been in the space, but do you need money for the facility itself?
Actually,
Right.
I can answer that.
Okay,
It's
great.
more of an internal service.
Yeah.
Than, if you look at 78001 building reserve, this is different. This is a Fund 10 department, so general fund. So
Yeah.
they pay building reserve fees that goes into 4027 and 4016. which they're part of the overall pool, that's part of the maintenance, and they pay into the capital reserve, where you can't confuse it with Fund 21. Fund 21
Right.
is not in the general fund, so they pay rent and they pay another fee that is, that's a different amount, so.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks to both of you.
So they do pay and they're on the capital list.
Great.
Does anyone have any questions of me for adult or juvenile?
This is Denny. Just for perspective, I had a question. In the parole officers, I know the jail's down, but in the parole officers, how many clients or parolees do each parole officer manage? What does that caseload look like right now? You said it's large.
Great question.
For adult.
For both adults and juvenile, but really,
Yeah, I would say the gold standard and what I wish we could get our caseloads to on the adult side would probably be 30, 40 to actually do the real effective work that we need to do. I want to say we're probably sitting around between 55 to 65. And, we're constantly trying to make changes should we see one particular caseload inflate. On the juvenile side, I want to say our caseload numbers are between 25 and 30. And I would just mention it's a little bit different on the juvenile side because they're not only working with the youth, but they're also working with the families. So there's a great deal more work.
okay. Thank you.
And they also on the juvenile side do pre-adjudicated work as well, the juvenile probation officers do. Did that answer your question?
That did. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, if you don't have any other questions, I guess I can log off and let the sheriff take over.
Anybody have any other questions? Jessica?
Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you.
Good to see your faces. Take care,
Good
everyone.
to see you too.
I waved from outside the brick building. So Ken, this is probably more of a question for you about juvenile detention, is that they have a beginning balance proposed of 255. Maybe I should.
No, go ahead.
Okay. And then it looks like it's consistently like last year it was I'm seeing 434 for essentially an ending balance for the previous fiscal year. Is there? But the ending balance for this year is quite low.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Back, I got a speaker in my, say the thing.
I'm just seeing that budgeted beginning balances and then but audited ending balances were both considerably higher than this ending balance. I realize it's a general fund budget, but
No, it's one of those that it's probably a better question for Jessica and
Okay.
Vicky to kind of get to the details. I don't.
Yeah.
I will say that this is the exercises of projecting beginning balances is always a challenge because there's a lot of unknowns and we don't necessarily go in and adjust beginning balances. And a lot of it has to do with vacancies and some of them could be some challenges. And just looking at some of the actuals and knowing that they typically budget, a pretty good amount in their extra health lines, but recognizing that Scott needs to have funds available for on-call relief. And so you'll see some savings there. And then also, I think there's some other challenges, with some of their full-time positions too, where they're probably getting some cost savings built into there that wasn't anticipated. But I mean, you're right, and it's probably a Vicky Wood, Scott Posh question.
I'll check in with Vicky. Thanks. Great, thank you.
So the sheriff has joined us.
How's it going?
Hi, Sheriff.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi.
Can you see the sun? In Hawaii?
This question is, did he draw that or his daughter draw that?
All right,
Okay. Ready?
I believe we are.
I think we are ready.
We're ready.
Okay, I just didn't see Commissioner stare. There she is. Got her. All right, so what I figured I would do is start off with just a couple general comments about the budget, hit all the big highlights, and then you guys have any follow-up questions specific to COVID-19, our response, our protocols, stuff like that. We can do that at the very end. Allow me to do the entire budget first, and then we can circle back to that. As I said last year, you'll be, when you start looking through these budgets, all of our materials and services have been remaining flat. And we have not increased those dollars at all, primarily because our additional 8.5% personnel increase eats up quite a bit of our budget. And all of those add back memos that you guys have received to balance the budget, like Ken had mentioned. He's already made the adjustments in the budget that you guys are seeing right now. But all those requests are specific to personnel increases, costs for our salaries. And then also, pretty much all those budgets are also budgeted with a zero ending balance, which we traditionally don't do. But as you'll see, at the end of the day, all those adjustments will come up with a zero ending balance. And with our hiring processes that we've been going through for the last year and a half, 2 years, we should be fully staffed. Started July. We have, I think, 4 staff starting on May 9th. And we have 2 or 3 more that are in the hopper. And so they should all be on board starting by July 1st. What that means for our budgets is that we have some sort of savings from personnel throughout the year with some vacancies. But with all those positions full, we will not be seeing those same savings. Real quick, it's not a budget you can see, but as Jessica had made a comment about 21.1, 8.5% cut project that the state's are doing. In that particular fund, we do have 3 staff members that are paid for out of that for our 11.5 population. What we did, just as an exercise, just to be prepared in case they do come through with that cut, is we have factored in that we can remove those 3 staff members and take them from a top step deputy and move them to our lowest paid entry level deputy. That will provide the needed savings that we could see in that budget if we had to cut that 8.5%. But moving on to our 1041 budget, we did that in 2141. That cut that we make out of that budget will then have to be made up in our 1041 budget because we're transferring those staff back to 1040. Okay, so our first budget is on page 80, which is our jail budget, 1041. As I said, we're in the final stages of hiring the 2 last deputy positions that we have available. One of the requests that we made to the budget committee was a move of a full FTE into our court security budget. Basically, that was to properly identify the staff that we have working up in that in the court security. That transition of that FTE provided a little bit of a savings in our jail fund. However, we've also learned just recently, we have a MAT program, our Medicated Assisted Treatment Program at our jail, that is currently funded through the Oregon Health Authority on a grant of $250,000 that we've brought in this year. We anticipate not spending close to $135,000 of that grant fund,
And so they've given us the authority to carry that into the next fiscal year to continue that program. Primarily because we've seen that our numbers have dipped because of our population is lower. So we have a lot less people in the program. So what that means for the budget, if you were to look at the first page, we have a proposed beginning balance of 400,000. But does that funding that we'd be carrying over from this fiscal year would be restricted grant funds? I would make a recommendation that we move 135,000 of that 400,000 beginning balance into the restricted beginning balance reserve line of 30102.
What was that number again, Sheriff?
35.
It would be 135,000 and would go in 1041 30102. And then the 30101 beginning balance would go to 265. And here in a little bit, I'll show you exactly where that ends up coming out on the expense side. Our personnel lines, like I said, that includes our 8.5% pay raise. So all the changes you see in the personnel lines just consist of that pay increase. If you go to page 81, to our materials and services, as I had indicated, we're keeping those numbers pretty much flat. But where we would account for that additional 135,000 for the MAT program would be, the first line is 51201, which is titled drugs. We put 35,000 into the drugs. And then in our 6101 professional service line, we put 100,000 for the professional service for that program. So our total for material services would actually increase by that 135, which makes us an ending balance, or a total for materials and service would be 2,160,276.
Sheriff?
Yes.
Maybe this is something, but if all we're doing is reducing the beginning balance and moving that to a reserve line, but if we're increasing the expenses, we didn't increase the revenue.
Correct.
So are we reducing other expense lines?
No, so what happened is, so on that memo that we have talking about the one FTE transfer position from the jail to court security. That add back requested an add back of 127,000. That dollar amount is actually can be accommodated in the jail budget because we're moving a top step deputy out and putting a lower step deputy in. And our ending balances are trending a little bit higher than we projected at 400,000. So with the changes that you've already made to the budget, which is that I'm looking at the memo right now. It's like just shy of 135,000. It's like 133,000. 134,786 to be exact. That balance we've already made the adjustment for. With the move and the additional ending balance that we think we might have, we technically didn't need that. And we found out from the health authority that we're going to be able to carry over the 135, and that's where that difference this comes up. Does that make sense?
No. I'm sorry. Sorry, Sharon.
We've already,
I'm looking at it because you built a budget right now, and how I am looking at this. So your total revenues are 586,703 plus your discretionary allocation. Your total expenses, so you adjusted the beginning balance to move 135,000 from your beginning balance into a reserve to the future line. That didn't necessarily increase or decrease your revenues.
correct.
but you're increasing your expenses below, but this budget that's in this binder right now is already balanced to the discretionary allocation with the increase.
Yes, so with that discretionary allocation increase, which was 154,786, when we put the memo together, when we talked about transitioning to FTE, that FTE transfer, when we made those investments, washed out for that additional discretionary allocation. And since you've already given that discretionary allocation to us, that's where that 135,000 is made.
I'll have to
I like the
circle
raised
back.
eyebrows. You saw this.
I'll have to circle back on that because I know there's a lot of moving pieces that went into this.
Right, so
In
what
order
happened
to-
was, because when we entered the budget back in, like eons ago, in February, then we had the conversation about transferring the FTE. When we did that transfer of FTE memo that you guys had made the adjustments for, it actually gives us a savings. It gave us an additional ending balance, because we're transferring a higher rate employee out of the jail and backfilling it with an entry level position. So there was an additional savings, so we didn't need the, because that position's removed out of the 1041 budget, we didn't need that expense anymore in 1041, if that makes sense. So the request that we needed to add that money in, a month later, we make this move, and of course, because we didn't have our presentation back in April, it would have been addressed in that presentation that need wasn't actually there anymore. But since it's already been made, we need it now because we need to carry over that 135,000.
Just
So at the end of the day, it's still a wash. Because you've already given us that additional revenue in the discretionary allocation.
So just to explain a little bit, just with numbers, there was an FTE that was shifted from 1041, the jail budget, to 1086, which is court security. And that amount, and in order to cover that amount, the discretionary allocation to the jail was reduced by that amount and increased in 1086 to cover that position. So it was an internal team transfer of 144,160 in order to balance. The jail budget was still out of balance with that FTE being shifted out because of the personnel expenses. And so to balance the budget, the increase to the jail budget 1041 was actually 131,345 to balance. So all those changes were made or built into this budget. So in order to add additional expense to the expense categories, whether it's in personnel or materials and services, there wasn't an increase beyond what I just described to the revenue side. So to add $135,000 of additional expense down to materials and services, with this budget out of balance by $135,000.
Okay, well, I'll circle back and look at our numbers because how I calculated it yesterday, it looked like it was gonna be pretty much a wash. So I'll have to circle back, and either way, that 135,000 that we can carry over for the program, we've already received that money, and so we have to reserve that to spend on the program in 2021. And so if we're going to move that program along, that 135,000 in revenue can't be used to balance the personnel side. So
Just a quick question, just to clarify, and I apologize for so many questions.
No, this is helpful to me, so I appreciate it.
So the MAT funding that you're carrying over it was included in your original ending balance forecast of that 400,000, or is it in addition to that 400,000 that you forecasted for beginning balance?
It would be within that 400,000. However, we're probably gonna come in closer to 550 maybe 600,000 as an ending balance. So if you want me to rerun all of our numbers and try to recalculate what we're gonna spend completely out of that project and earmark the 135 and come up with a new ending balance, we can do that as well.
Because I'm just trying to understand where that 135,000, if it was included in the 400,000, or if it's in addition to. If it's in addition to, if the updated information dictates that your balance is going to be higher, we could build that in and then increase your expenses down below to match that adjustment to your beginning balance.
Yeah, so when we did the initial entry, we anticipated spending all that money, because that was back in January when we built the budget. And then when COVID-19 hit, our projected expenses went way down. And so now, as we're adjusting our ending balances and our projected carryover, it's gonna be in addition to that 400,000, we'll have an 135,000 that is going to be carried over specific to. So we could leave the 400,000 beginning balance and then just add a beginning balance reserve of 135. And then that will factor in all the way through. But I'd have to rerun the numbers to get you the exact numbers for each balance and each line. And I can do that before you guys deliver it tomorrow.
Yeah, I understand what it's talking about.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Sorry for all the questions, Sheriff. I know it's hard to
No,
do it in
okay.
this type of setting, but I want to make sure I understand exactly, what changes we're making.
Not a problem. I knew that when we found out we were gonna have that money to carry over, I was gonna have to account for it as an expense someplace. And then I need to account for it as revenue because it can't just be, it needs to be earmarked specifically for that.
Great, thanks, Sheriff. Thanks, Ken.
Other than that, any questions about the jail budget?
No.
Okay. Let's move on to our next bit, which is page 82, which is our 1042 Marine budget. So with this particular budget, we had significant carryover at the end of last year. We had originally anticipated only bringing in, having a beginning balance of 25,000. We ended up bringing in 62,660. And so if we built this budget, that revenue is available to us right now, but obviously because it's budget deposit, we can't get to it. But we have a need in our main budget to purchase a new vehicle to tow the public. And so in this particular budget, other than our staffing and all pretty much being status quo, the only thing that we're looking at doing is adding dollars in a capital vehicle purchase line. And I don't off the top of my head know what that code is, but it's a capital vehicle purchase line. And it's gonna put 32,000 in that line. And just take that off the ending balance and make ending balance of 36,827.
Okay, so we're going to add
A vehicle purchase.
a capital line, which is going to be a 1042 800 number, or it's going to be an 800 series, which is a capital line. And,
Yeah, I think it's 802,
okay,
which is a vehicle capital. And that will take care of that conversation we had last week.
right.
So we'll be able to order a vehicle for towing purposes for the Marine program, and that is a cleaner to bring those funds available for us to use for that expense.
Okay.
Other than that, as you'll see, the Marine Fund continues to support us through their grant. We continue to advocate for funding from the Marine Board. They continue to get more pressure from constituents that live in that area who want to run boats on the water and those who live on the water and don't want the boats there. And so either way, we continue to tell the Marine Board that if they want us out there on a regular basis, almost full time, they need to find ways to fund it. And so the limited insurance allocation that the county gives to us every year, as done in the past, primarily goes to materials and services, the building rent, fuel, and motor pool expenses. And then every dollar the Marine Board gives to us, we put into hours on the river. It's an easier way for us to justify to the Marine Board that they're not giving us enough money. Any questions about the river?
Yeah, I got a quick question, Tim. This is Denny.
Yeah.
Who's designing the buoy system on the river to understand where the wake boats can be, and who's designing that whole system through there?
So that is a division or a section within the Marine Corps. They take public comment at different times, but that entire buoy system was designed for and implemented by the Marine Corps. We've tried to give them recommendations because it's extremely confusing. All the regulations that they have on the river are almost impossible to enforce, primarily because the distance across the river, the amount of boats that are out there, and we don't have the proper equipment even to be able to enforce some of the things that they're wanting us to enforce. So ultimately, the buoys are the control of the Marine Board. They decide where they're going to be placed, and they back to square one.
All right, I'm glad you told me that it wasn't you guys. It could not be more confusing.
I
I'm
know
out
what you're
there
saying. I know
3 or
what
4
you're
times a
saying.
week in the summer, and nobody that I talk to understands where you can and where you cannot surf, run your boat. There's no way to keep distances. So
Right.
just a clear sign would be great.
It's true.
Like no wake zone.
There is that one caveat that's built into the rule that basically says, if you can't meet the guidelines, then just drive down the middle of the river.
As fast as you can.
There you go. All right.
Sheriff, there was some new changes passed in the legislature, I think with new licenses or permits or something for wakeboarding. How is that going to roll out? Is that?
So they are currently working on an online training program on how to do it. There was a lot of questions back and forth because it was supposed to be similar to a Carter's Ed card, but it's more going to be like the way they designed it, it's by the boat. So one person takes the test and they stick her on the boat. That doesn't mean that the other 5 people that have on the boat know exactly what they're doing, and they may be operating the boat at any given time. So it's going to be kind of a crazy little educational time on that piece. But I know the Marine Board, that was one of their fixes to try to eliminate some of the concerns on the stretch. They basically saying we're going to train individuals who are operating their boat on how to safely operate their boat, which in essence is what the owner said part is already for. This is just an additional certification that you have to have.
Thank you.
All right. If you want to, we can do page 83. And this is our school budget. Some of the things on this that we are looking at is some of our contract cities are still kind of up there on what they're going to do. Primarily going to be a matter of whether or not they can continue to afford the same number of deputies they have assigned at the current steps that we build them, versus needing to be billed a lower step deputy if we assign them a lower step position. We have one city that is contemplating reducing the patrol from 2 to 1. One position that we have that we're waiting to fill in our patrol division is contingent on that particular contract. If they come back and say that they are not able to fill that position, then we will not hire that last position we have available to us. Just like our jail division, we're trending a little higher on our ending balance than what we budgeted for back in February. That has a lot to do with kind of uncertainties on some of our overtime expenses. And also, in addition to that, we have had quite a bit of personnel savings because it's taken us a little long to go through the hiring process and out on board. So in our patrol budget, as we had mentioned in the jail, all of our personnel numbers accommodate for that 8.5% pay raise that they're set to get in July. The major conversation is down in arterial and services. You can see in our professional services line that we budget $10,000 a year in that. The last 2 years, I've kept those lines flat because if I increase anything on the materials and services side, that means that there's that much more money that needs to be added to this fund to balance because of the significant increases in our personnel costs. But one of the reasons why this year, year to date, we have spent so much in that line primarily has to do with our hiring process. For those who are aware that we pushed a lot in lateral hires. And when we bring in someone who's already been employed by another agency and we bring them on board, there's a huge cost savings and benefit to our office. Significant shorter training time as opposed to having going through 4 months of training, 4 months of the academy. We get them within 6 to 7 weeks. They're in a car on their own doing the job. But with that also comes the ORS statute that allows for smaller agencies to request reimbursement for their training expenses of those individuals if they leave employment prior to 3 years of service. And so that professional work service line counts for approximately $73,000 in reimbursement training costs that we had to send to 2 different agencies for 2 of our lateral hires. On the Congress side, for each of those individuals, had we brought them in entry level and put them through their training, we would have spent closer to $120,000 per deputy to get them trained. So it's kind of a hard pill to swallow when you have to write a check to another agency for such a large dollar amount. But at the end of the day, the investment is a lot better for our office because we've got an instant employee that's out on the road within weeks. And then the other thing that I would like to draw your attention to, which I guess is also in the revenue side, we have a new line in there. It's a forfeiture revenue, a federal forfeiture justice revenue line. It's in the revenue section under 350 1A on page 83 for $250,000. Then we have a placeholder in our material and service expense on page 84. It's $699.01. That particular federal forfeiture has to do with the Coaster case we dealt with the FBI and a piece of property up on Meadow Lake Road. We will receive 35% of the sales price of that property. I noticed this week it finally closed. It closed roughly $66,000 higher than their asking price. And we put this $250,000 in. We anticipated it to be sold at a lower price. If we get a full 35% of the sales price, it would be roughly $265,000 that would be coming to us. I anticipate it being less than that because there's probably going to be some attorney's fees and a few other things, realtor fees on top of that sales price. We've got this in here just as a placeholder because we don't know when we're going to have the money available to us. But when the money comes, we'll get notice from the federal government that it's available. There's a very strong possibility that that money will be available to us in the next few weeks. And if that happens, then we would need to make a change for the June budget, move that additional revenue that was going to come in as an ending balance and move it into a beginning balance reserve forfeiture line that earmarks the forfeiture dollars moving forward. The key to this piece is when we see something like this, that $250,000, according to federal guidelines, can be used to supplement our budget, but it cannot be used to replace any of our existing expenses, which means we have additional money to buy additional things and use it for additional expenses, but we can't use it to supplant some of our budget that we currently have, if that makes sense.
Sheriff, I have a question. This is Mary. The anticipated loss in CHL revenue, are you anticipating that catching back up once the pipeline is open, or do you figure it's just pretty much just going to be reduced?
Yeah, we have a reduction primarily because that revenue is more for our new CHLs. So yes, as soon as we open up the door to start fingerprinting people who are applying for a new CHL, but we're still processing all renewals through the mail. Is to do that. So people who are needing to renew, that revenue is still coming through. But yeah, as soon as we start allowing new CHLs, then I would see a significant increase in that line just for the new CHL process.
But as far as the bottom line, this is just ballpark. You're anticipating it's going to remain the same. It's just going to take a while for it to all come in.
Yeah, I don't anticipate a reduction in new CHLs. I would anticipate that you're going to see in 1 month we have like a 300% increase, because once we open the door, allow them to come in, and they're all going to come in at once. So I would anticipate that number continue to stay level. We process at times, depending on what's going on in the world, anywhere between 30 to 40 new CHLs sometimes. So I would anticipate us seeing a huge influx of people who come in.
Thank you.
Sheriff, this is Lindsay. Did you say 30 to 40 per week or month? I missed that.
Per week.
Per week. Okay.
And that depends on what's going on in the world. There's a lot of politics going on, we see a larger number. If there's not much going on in government, and the numbers are pretty low. I would anticipate with this COVID concern that you're going to find a lot of people wanting to apply for CHLs that have probably never considered applying for a CHL. And so I anticipate see some of those numbers go up.
Okay. And just for clarification, what line item is that in the revenue?
Second from the top.
It comes up in our weapons permit line.
Weapons permit. Okay.
91.
Okay. Thank you.
Sheriff, a question, this is Ken. You mentioned some updated projected beginning balance.
Yes.
For both this and the jail budget. Do you know approximately how much of the change that you're talking about with those funds? I just want, and I don't know how quickly you could get those numbers, because I'm thinking, because you have a couple of asks that even though we built this in because I had to present a balanced budget, the request for the additional discretionary will still be at the, will require deliberation and votes tomorrow. And I'm just wondering if we need to modify those requests any, if you're anticipating more of a beginning balance for next year, that if we need to increase those beginning balances, it may reduce the request of additional discretionary that you're making.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so part of the process with the projections obviously is it's a moving target. So I always budget very conservative with a lower number anticipated, understanding that if it comes in higher, great, we have more savings, great. So we can try to dial the number in as close as possible. Ultimately, at the end of the day, which is, this is gonna be a conversation for the budget committee, is with the budget presented the way it is, with the dollar amounts needed to balance for the personnel costs, if there's additional savings at the end of this fiscal year, moving into next budget year, that could offset some of the ask. But this time next year, I'm gonna be in the exact same position, because they've got another 8.5% coming. And with this budget built the way it is right now, with no projected ending balance, which obviously we never spend everything we budget for, but with a zero ending balance, I typically want to have a budgeted ending balance of close to 250, 300,000, just as a buffer moving forward for personnel, and for any other personnel increases. So I can get you the numbers of what we think it might be, understanding that that's all dependent on things continuing to stay the way we think they're gonna stay. And if we have any unexpected increases in personnel costs and overtime or anything like that, that we haven't projected for, it could adjust that number at the end of the day. But I think the conversation would be, if we leave it as is status quo with the understanding that we may have a higher ending balance in some of these funds, that those higher ending balances are just gonna go to the ending balance of next fiscal year, which will eliminate a little bit of the ask next year for the same increase, if that makes sense.
It's what we talked about last year too.
Sheriff, this is Rick. I'm a new member here. Could you help me understand the sheriff's sales where you're proposing 2 million and yet you don't seem to have met that the last several years and yet you're projecting it again?
Correct. So that is the wonderful in and out of all foreclosed properties. So when someone forecloses on a house, the bank takes it and they process it through the courts for the sheriff to sell on the footsteps of the courthouse. We have to show a revenue line, and then we have to have an expense line that matches that. Problem with closures is there's absolutely no way for us to project what those might be. When we had the huge housing crisis about 4 or 5 years ago, if we go back in historical budgets, you'd see that sheriff's sale line was closer to 8 million and an 8 million expense, because we were processing close to $8 million worth of sales. So far this year, we processed just under 1 million in sales. And if we sell one house on the front steps of the courthouse for 400,000 or 500,000, that bumps us up to 1.5. And we have to have that in the revenue and expense. So because it's an equal in and out, it doesn't affect any of the other part of the budget, but we used to have it at a closer to the 5 million mark. But when we saw that the sales were started to progress to slowly dip, we moved it down to 2 million. My concern would be in the next year or two, if we start having additional issues in housing and we have people losing their houses and foreclosures, then our sales are going to go back through the roof and we're going to have that number in there. So we left it at 2 million just because we don't know what the next year is going to look like. And so far, we've been within that dollar amount. There's a good chance that we may reach 2 million next year.
Thank you.
Yep.
Sheriff, this is Lindsay. I'm looking at the memos in the front of the packet. There's 3 different ones. Is it accurate to say that the shortfall is around 750,000 for this fiscal year for personnel?
The full shortfall, well, 1041, it looks like it was 134.
738, does that sound right for the 1041 memo?
Yeah, there's 3 different funds, but they're all personnel related in terms of increases. So total, it looks like the shortfall is about 750. Is that accurate to say?
Yes, that is correct.
And you're anticipating that again next fiscal year?
Yes, because they're gonna have another 8.5%, and I'll go up in steps, and their certification, and cert incentives go up. So it'll be higher than that next year.
Thank you.
Just to clarify, because, sometimes the numbers, because when we get it entered into the system and then when I balance the discretionary allocation, what we currently have in order to balance for the jail, it was 131,345. And for patrol, it was 577,81, for a total of 702,126.
Okay, there was a third one in here.
The third one is that for emergency management.
43,000 for 1040
Yes, that's for emergency management,
emergency management. Okay.
which is a little odd because it doesn't actually show up in the criminal justice team because that's a holdover. It was moved, a few years ago to the sheriff's office, but it used to be a Fund 10 department. It still is a,
It is a fun.
it's a Fund 10, but it used to be under general government.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're right, plus the 43,000 for emergency management on top of that.
All right, any other questions on the patrol budget?
Thanks, Sheriff.
All right. Let's move to page 86. That is our drug enforcement fund. As you know, Vicent still to this day is not an active team. However, there's still some significant forfeiture dollars that remain in that fund that we're required to manage. All those dollars were forfeited and brought in under the sheriff's office and the county ORI number, which means that we have to maintain the funds. What we do in this particular fund is anything in our patrol budget that is drug enforcement related that we can code to that people. Primarily it's for training expenses, some equipment, cell phones. We've got a TrueNarc system, which is allows us to test narcotics without having to open up a package. We also have the Celebrate phone system, allows us to break into people's cell phones if we need to. That software, licensing and all those charges for all of that specific investigative couldn't come out of this fund. We also have, which I don't know if you guys were on the news register or not, but we did win a property forfeiture case through our drug team. It was a property that we seized in relation to a delivery case up outside of Yamhill, Carlton area. That particular property, that decision is under appeal. So we anticipate that taking at least a year or two before it gets through the appeals courts before we're able to do anything with that property. Any questions regarding this? All right, so next budget is on page 87. That's our 1086 for security. So as we mentioned, we moved that additional FTE out of our patrol, out of our jail budget. So now you'll see that we have 2 deputies assigned for security and 1 sergeant. And the other piece that I want to talk about has to do with Paul Industries. So the Paul Industries are the people that work at the front that run that scanning station. But over the last several years, they had increases in their contract that they had not applied the process rate as consistent as they should have, and they just recently got us all caught up. So you can see that there's a significant, increase in that cost for that service in our budgeted line, which is under, 61102. Last year, or this current fiscal year, we budgeted just under 80,000. But, moving forward in the next fiscal with all their adjustments and the additional 3% we anticipate and increasing, after July 1, it goes to 113,000. Just for a reminder, that accounts for 8 hours of security at the front door. We would not be able to, with our existing personnel, provide that service at that scanning station. The amount of time that they're there for that dollar amount, I still think it's a good investment for the county to continue to maintain for that contract. But other than that, there are no other any questions about court tier? All right, so now we'll move to page 88, this is 10.160. This is the radio system fund. So we are still in the process of finalizing the contract on the site survey of our entire system. We have picked a vendor that's going to come in and do an evaluation of our radio system. Obviously, because of the last 3 months of COVID, that has slowed down significantly, but I still anticipate entering into a contract this fiscal year, hopefully to get that project done. We budgeted in next year's budget, the 50,000 in that professional services line, just in case it's 61001, just in case we need to start the project after July 1. But I didn't fully anticipate being able to spend it this year. The agreement that we had with Wycom for the new budget committee covers the history of this system. It used to be managed by Wycom, the Communications Dispatch Center, and approximately 5 years ago, they transferred the management of this entire system under my office, and part of that agreement was the county entered into an MOU with Wycom to provide 5 specific in return of them sending this fund $270,300 a year for a user. We are in year 5 of that agreement. It actually ends June 30th. There is a clause that allows for us to do a 1-year extension on mutual agreement between Wycom and the county, which we've already discussed. So they are going to extend that MOU for 1 year for an additional $270,300. And I will start communicating with the director of Wycom over the next fiscal year to come up with a new agreement. And she's already indicated that she would like to change that 270,300 to a little easier number to remember, closer to like 300,000. So what that means for our radio system is that with that money that comes in every year from the users, that gives us plenty of money to maintain the system on a regular basis, and gives us, as you'll see, we are going to be putting a reserve in the 990.03 line of 700,000 into a reserve for a future build out of our radio system. Jessica had indicated the digital upgrade that the city of Yamhill is doing. This site survey and system-wide evaluation will give us the direction on where we need to go for our upgrade. And the company that's working on this particular survey is the same company that has been working with Marion County Sheriff's Office on their digital upgrade through the entire county. It's the exact same backbone as our radio system, which will give us a good understanding of where we need to go with our countywide system.
I have a question for you, Sheriff. When I look at the expenses that have 40109, the 2 FTE is lieutenant, are those actually certified officers Or are they the radio mechanics? What are they?
So that's a point two, for retired Lieutenant Steve Warden, who's the emergency manager for Grand Ron. He's also our radio advisory person. We hired him part-time as a part-time employee to maintain the user group conversation among all the fire agencies and all the users on the system. And he's the liaison between those users and our radio contractor, Dan Apperson.
I just thought it was strange that they were classified as lieutenants.
This was set up quite some time ago with the system and, just identifying that there is a retired deputy who's holding this position.
He actually held the rank of lieutenant when he retired. And so in the system, for him being hired back, he used to run our program. His coach in the GEM system is lieutenant. So that's the only reason why.
And what's the second FT, the second FTE?
That's a point.
It's
Yeah,
actually
it's just a point.
Oh, that's just a
Point two.
point. Got it.
Yeah,
Okay, thanks, Sheriff.
not a problem. Any questions about the radios?
We were just talking about them yesterday, I think, so it's good to get clarity.
All right, so into the account on page 89, 1347, dog control. So there's a lot going on with that. And some of it has slowed down just a little bit because of COVID and home balance contract and a few things. We are still on track to transition our entire operation to Homeward Bound. So a couple things that we have. The most important thing has to do with clerical services that we hired to contract with them. They've been training with our staff so many hours a week to get trained up on what it is that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. We're in the final testing phases of the new Helion software, which is to allow us to transition all of our existing data from our database on dogs and who owns them and all the licensing information and move into that product. And our hope is to get those, all the testing and everything done with that software and trained up on it to go live at the end of this fiscal year. Once that software is gone live and we're able to test it, and the clerical staff from Bound has been trained up on it, that's when we'll start transitioning all of that work over to Homeward Bound. The revenue sharing conversation, which I know a lot of people always ask about the revenue sharing, a large percentage of our revenue that does come into dog control still falls within the city limits of McMinnville and Newburgh-Benton. And under our current agreement, we're continuing to process those licensing fees and then sending it out to those jurisdictions quarterly. What we've noticed is that revenue and distribution percentage, that total revenue is actually slightly down this year than it was last year. And that could be for all sorts of reasons. But it ultimately doesn't really affect us other than 25% that we can take off the top. If we have less coming in, then we take less on our cut. However, with this budget, the board traditionally at our April meeting, I present them with a memo that traditionally talks about our trust fund that we received in that large donation and where we're at as far as our expenses. I will be presenting a memo to the board in the next couple of weeks that just highlights where we're at to meet the trust requirement. But I can tell you that through last fiscal year and this current fiscal year, we've been able to maintain that trust balance of $253,251. So I do not anticipate having to spend any of that money. But in the budget you have sitting in front of you, we are budgeting to spend roughly $50,000 of that trust funds which would go directly to the homeward bound contract.
Sheriff, maybe you could, because we do have a new member of the budget committee, maybe clarify what those trust funds can specifically be used for, the conditions associated with that.
Yeah, so the trust basically says care and maintenance of dogs. We received that trust donation, and we still had, shortly after we made the decision to close our kennel division. What we use that money for is basically the contract with that rental that we have with Homeward Bound. So basically, any dollar they spend on the care, maintenance, and medical of the dogs we have in our possession, Yamhill County's possession, on the Homeward Bound, can be accounted for those funds. We have expenses outside of that, which trust funds cannot be used. The trust requirement, in addition to that, is that we, the sheriff's office, sends a memo to the board once a year outlining what we've spent out of that trust fund and what it was spent on. And so traditionally, in the first budget meeting we have in April, just the board, that's when I handed to them the memo, giving them the update on where we're at with that trust. Because we skipped that step, I will be sending that memo directly to the board in a couple weeks for their review.
Sheriff, this is Mary. A question came up yesterday, and I was asking about Angel Fund. I know you mentioned that the trust covers medical care as well. Have we tapped into Angel Fund, and where are we when it comes to that type of reimbursement to Homeward Bound?
So I don't believe we've tapped into Angel Fund for dogs that are in our possession. So if we have a dog sitting out at Homeward Bound and it's under the 3 or 4 day waiting period, or it's being held for us by Homeward Bound, any medical expenses that are incurred during that time will be put back and billed back to our office, and then we could use the trust funds for them. As far as the Angel Fund dollars that they have available to them, those are applied to the dogs that are not in our possession. So once we transfer the ownership of the dog from us to them, then they use that fund to pay for those medical expenses.
So if a dog is relinquished or no one's picking the dog up, basically it's on them to figure out if the dog needs surgery or some medical care, and it has to come from them. Because we have an ask. Yeah, we have an ask from them regarding some funding for that particular purpose.
Yeah, so within the contract reads, I believe there's a section in there that talks about how long we hold on to them, and then at what point we turn them over to them. Part of the transfer of ownership to Homeward Bound is they also see all the revenue from the adoption fees and that they charge adopting the dog. But if there's, for whatever reason, significant medical issues that come up after we transferred ownership to them, then that would be paid for through the Angel Fund. Where I think we see a part of it is where we get dogs, primarily from the city, that are brought in at different times that may or may not be, they're either directed to Homeward Bound by law enforcement and tells the private citizen to just take it to Homeward Bound, then Homeward Bound takes them in. They're not necessarily taking them in on behalf of the law enforcement agency. And so I think there's been times where there's been dogs or cats in my cars, for example, and they get dropped off at Homeward Bound. There's an expense that Homeward Bound has to help provide medical care for those dogs that don't necessarily fall under sheriff's office or the city.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions on dog control?
No, thank you.
Okay, all right, and then the last one I just talked about. Let's go to 441, which is the jail capital fund. For no reason, my budget sheet doesn't have a page number on it, so I don't know what page
Page
91. Yeah, 91. All right, so this is the jail capital fund for improvements to the jail. For the new budget committee member, the history on this particular fund is, as Ken had mentioned earlier, most of the general funds pay a building rent to the county, which a portion of that goes into a capital improvement fund. So anytime there's an improvement to the building, basically the county's our landlord, we're paying them rent. And if we need an improvement, we apply for improvements and then they come and fix it. The jail has never been set up on the capital improvement line item through the county, through general fund. Except for a small portion of the jail, for whatever reason, was given a square footage and we were paying rent into that. But for the most of the jail, there's no revenue that goes in there. Traditionally, it was all bed rental money. We used to rent beds at Benton County, and all that revenue that came in would come into this line. So all the major improvements that we made to that facility in the last 10 or 15 years have all been paid for off the bed rental money that's come in from Benton County. We did a major Sally Port renovation, intake heating room renovation, and a medical facility for close to $3.3 million. That was all paid for on Benton County dollars. A few years back, Benton County up and pulled their contract and decided they were going to go someplace else, and they went someplace else. We no longer have bed rental dollars coming in, and that basically freed up, froze our revenue stream coming into this budget. Then, on top of that, we have all these major projects that have come into play. One of the largest projects that we've had since our remodel is our jail camera system. Our jail camera system in the facility, some of the cameras were the existing cameras from when it was built. We have everything from coax cable to Cat5 to Cat 6, 7 lines. It depends on when the camera was put in, and will determine what type of technology that it's connected to. The control room that we have, where there's a large number of TV screens, touchscreen system that allows us to touch a door, and it opens up the airlock and allows the deputy to get into the door. That particular database is built on a system that is no longer supported. And so we had a need to redo all of our cameras, redo all of our wiring, and we need to redo our intercom and control panel and control room technology. So we entered into a contract. This was a conversation we had last year. We entered into a contract with Siemens and Accurate. That particular contract total is, I think, 1.3 million, give or take. That is going to replace all of the cameras in our facility, run all new wire, all new intercoms, and a whole new control room to state-of-the-art technology that allows us to operate that facility much more efficiently. That project is still underway. They've begun all of that. Phase 1, tentative install date to start installing cameras is at the end of this month. And we've seen a few additional incidental costs to include. We anticipated having significant savings in camera locations and the number of cameras on that project. We did reduce the total number of cameras in our facility by a handful. But then at the same time, our staff, along with their staff, identified a few others that we needed to add. And so there's been a little bit of movement on that, but for the most part, that project is still moving. But with that, there are other objects and other items that still need to be addressed in that facility. And there should have been a capital improvement list that you guys received as well. It kind of outlines some of the projects that we're looking at doing. But with that, there's been that conversation And I know this is probably where I'll lean pretty heavily on Ken, because he was the numbers guy to try to figure out how this is all going to work. But there's been some conversation of moving some funds around and some interfund loans. And then we're also set up a transfer from the 2141, 1145 fund. There's a small dollar amount that's being transferred every year now into this line to build up that reserve. So other than that, Ken, you might be more privy onto the details on the interfund loan conversation and where that money is coming from and how it's going to look moving forward.
Right, and I would just, if it looks like this may be one of the budgets that we may need to, because if the project is carrying over into the next year, we'll have to make some adjustments to reflect that in the beginning balance and also in the expense line to capture those expenses that are going to be occurring next year. So that's something that will probably, prior to adoption, if the project, the way it's going, it looks like it is going to carry into the new year. Right now, the budget as presented is not, it's that the camera project's going to be 100% spent and completed prior to July 1. So this is something we're going to have to adjust. As far as you can see it in the year-to-date actuals, there was a couple of actions. One we did during the adoption of last year's budget. We did move $800,000, $500,000 or $500,000 of that came from insurance reserve. We did a transfer over into this fund. The other $300,000 was discretionary into this fund. And to help fund the rest of the project, we did an interfund loan from solid waste and from motor pool, which typically have a lot of expense authority in those budgets every year because of the requirements, and how those budgets are built. So we did an interfund loan of $500,000 into this, and what you see reflected in here is the repayment of that interfund loan. So it'll repay 10 years of the principal plus some interest back to those funds that we borrowed, the motor pool and solid waste, to replenish those funds for the $500,000 that was borrowed for this project. The other part, this is one of those that Jessica Beach referenced in her presentation, where we made a change in 2141 on the building rent and where those funds are being applied. A portion is going to 4116, which is jail maintenance, and a portion is going to this fund to not only, it's essentially paying back that loan for that loan. So those funds will be coming from 1145 money, Senate Bill 1145 money will be coming in here to help repay that loan. But also recognizing there's still not outside of that 1145 monies that are coming into this, there's no other revenue streams that are coming in for capital projects.
Got it.
So Ken, the total was 1.3 for the camera issue?
I thought we were getting closer to the sheriff would know. I haven't seen the actual one. Is it closer to 1.6?
In this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not to exceed 1.67. And that original contract for reference was a 1-for-1. So every camera we had currently, they were replaced with a new one. I think we went through and took out a handful, but then identified 9 additional, and the net increase outside of that contract was 5 cameras. So we'll see what's on, trying to figure out what we need to do on those 5 additional cameras.
And we borrowed more than what we actually needed just for that jail project, because there is, a list of other projects that are coming up. So we're looking at, well, the interfund loan is going to be used 100% towards the jail project. It would free up other existing funds that were in here to be able to have some funds available for other capital projects. Because keeping in mind that this is the fund that we use, that if a water heater goes down or an HVAC unit goes down, that these are the funds that we use to replace those. Sometimes they're scheduled projects, sometimes we end up having to access this because it's an unplanned project, but it's an immediate need and usually a major expense item. Back to you, Sheriff.
Okay, you guys have any other questions on that particular fund?
No, thanks.
Okay. All right. So now we come all the way to page 118. And this is our fund 1040, which is emergency management. So as you'll see, that one of the memos was for an additional discretionary allocation of roughly 43,000. That was specific to the personnel lines that we have for the increase. We anticipate receiving the same full amount from the Oregon Emergency Management as far as our grant is concerned, that 331 line. I put in 90,000. I think we're set to get 91 something and some change. So that is good news because traditionally that has been slowly being reduced every year by the state. And we've been flat the last 2 years. And so that's a good thing. You'll see that we're still working on we received a grant for some renovations and projects. We moved that entire emergency management facility a few months back out from underneath the clerk's office into their new units out at the county shops. It's a very nice area. When social distancing allows, we are going to be opening up that EOC for a public unveiling. It's very nice, nicely done. It's got all the technology that we need to run a major incident out of. It's a perfect location. It's got a nice generator that was purchased out of that grant that will sit there that will run that entire facility. So it's a really good project that we were able to do. The county also added a little bit of additional capital improvement funds. The county's been doing most of the work out there. We have a few things that are left to do, some exterior lighting, some fencing, got to put up some ham radio tower on the side of the building, and a few other some bollards to protect the generator from people backing into. But a lot of that stuff is just small little things that we'll be finishing up over time. But obviously, as the county maintenance people are available to finish up that project, we'll finish it up. Other than that, there's really no major issues with emergency management other than the same conversation with all the others, is that this is a budgeted ending balance of 0. The way that the staffing is concerned, that staff increase, we'll see another 8.5% moving forward. There is a possibility of some personnel savings. We do have an individual who's been in our office for several years that is contemplating moving on to do other things, and he's currently budgeted as a half-time position. That grant has kind of been put on hold because he's been working pretty hard to assist us with our public health COVID-19 response. And so as soon as things start clearing up, my guess is that he will decide to go on to do his other retirement job full-time. And so we may end up seeing some personal savings next year with that position.
Sheriff, it's Mary. I have a question about FEMA reimbursement. Do we have any idea now what that would look like?
I'll tell you that what's eligible to be reimbursed and what we want to be reimbursed for our tutor.
Mm-hmm.
My guess is we'll start seeing funds roll in, probably a year or so from now. The interesting part on emergency pension is a lot of our expenses that we've incurred during this pandemic are all just built into our existing budget. The expenses that we're seeing other departments that have primarily public health, a lot of those FEMA funds, they open up the process, trying to make it as easy as possible to apply for. But as you know, there's going to be a lot of red tape as far as when it's going to get through. We've had a lot of people do things specifically related to this. For example, a lot of our departments are working remotely now, teleworking. A lot of the department heads have implemented meetings such as this, this Microsoft Teams platform. My command staff, we meet daily on this from all over. We got staff that are from other parts of the state that can call in and have meetings. And so that required us to purchase a few portable Verizon jetpacks for wireless activity and connectivity. It's required us to purchase some microphones and headphones. And a lot of departments across the county have seen similar increases. Unfortunately, some of those increases and some of those costs, FEMA does not declare those basically reimbursable expenses in relation to the pandemic because they don't consider them life-saving requirements. It's considered just part of doing your job. You currently were already working. Now that you're doing telework, that's just part of you doing your job. So it's confusing and frustrating, I think, on a lot of levels because a lot of individuals were hoping that there's going to be a lot more of a government response. Where you're going to see a lot of the FEMA dollars are going to go directly to, I think, public health. Public health's overtime and responses directly to caring for people in this response, I think is where you're going to see a lot of those money. A lot of the money is getting freed up to be spent.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions about emergency management fund? Okay. Are there any
Sheriff,
general? Yes.
this is Lindsay. I have a general question. Is there anything that we've learned through this crisis in terms of emergency management that would be beneficial going forward in terms of a need?
There's not necessarily a real need other than what we've identified as technology needs to be our friend. I think what everyone has learned across the United States. I'm currently serving on a task force that's got 20 different states represented. I'm the state of Oregon representative. And one thing we've learned across the United States is that for the most part, once everybody was able to set up, private sector has been doing years when it comes to telecommunicating and telecommuting and being from home and having the ability to video conference using technology. Once they're able to put that into play, they're starting to see that they're able to operate pretty efficiently. The private sector has been doing that for years. A lot of individuals travel and work from home and work remotely, but public sector hasn't been doing that. That's a change in business. So from emergency response position, I think we had all the plans in place that we've activated that have allowed us to do the response that we need to. I think where we were lacking is the ability to remotely connect. But within short order, our county IT kind of kicked it into high gear and we're able to do what we needed to do to get our staff up and running. Now, it's very easy. Where operations, for the most part, for our office are running pretty smoothly when it comes to our interactions with our staff.
Thank you.
It's good to hear it's very easy. I've certainly seen you a lot more in the last month and a half.
Well, I can tell you that it definitely pushes people outside their comfort zone and outside the norm. We are creatures of habit in law enforcement, and so when it comes to public safety and changing the way we do things, man, that's like, I need to buy the book, Move My Cheese, and give it to every single one of our staff members. But once we've got our staff up and running on this, it works out very well. Any other questions specific to your general questions about COVID or anything?
Sheriff, what kind of questions are you getting about enforcement? Because I know I've been getting quite a few, and I'm trying to sort of deflect them in terms of acknowledging that who has what jurisdiction and that the cities it's going to be a different game.
Yeah, so, it's been, obviously all the executive orders that come down have a misdemeanor violation associated with it. All of the conversations across the entire state, from the Oregon Association of Chiefs of Police, State Police, Sheriff's Association, has all been education first. My concern is moving forward that there are going to be people who are wanting to move quicker than what the state is going to want to move. And I think there are parts of the state that probably have very good reason to be able to do that, and they should be allowed to do that. And if the state isn't going to open it up, I hear that some of these communities are going to do it on their own. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the enforcement is going to fall on the local jurisdiction to do the enforcement. We haven't locally, thankfully, seen too many issues. I think the biggest issue that we've been dealing with is just the amount of information that is being spread, and some of it misinformation on things that we're able to do and things we're not able to do. What county business is open and what county isn't. There was a thought that, for example, with our jail population, the conversation of reducing the total population of our facility over time, they just assume we open up the doors and let people walk out, and that's obviously far from the truth. Not even close to that. In fact, there was only 27 people that were in custody that were released prior to the end of their sentence, which were less than 30 days. And there were court orders from the judge saying we need to release these individuals because they meet our criteria. So it's, I think moving forward, the enforcement is going to be, we're going to keep on the education side. We're going to keep educating people, keep reminding them about safe social distancing, and continue to advocate for the ability to start releasing some of these restrictions when we can.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, well, hopefully that was endless for you guys.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Sheriff.
Thank you, Sheriff.
Yeah, sorry you guys didn't get to see me in person.
That's because you're in Hawaii.
Who drew your son, Sheriff?
Yeah, I even showered today, so don't worry.
Wow.
Okay, all right, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Let me know if you need anything.
Okay, thank you.
Is it all right if we take a break for 5 minutes?
Well, actually, maybe before we take the 5-minute break, I think that's all we have for presentations for this morning, because we already did the dispatch yesterday. So we're running a little bit ahead of schedule, so if we were gonna recess, it would kind of make sense. We're close enough to the lunch hour that maybe we recess with an extended lunch break, and then, because we got really ahead. I think presentations are going a lot faster remotely, and we covered a lot of the internal services. So I think with general government this afternoon with those presentations,
Let's
It's
recess
up to-
until 1:30.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. All right.
Thank you. 2-hour lunch break. Wow.
I know, lunch break was actually, because I know everybody's gonna run and check email, go off, check.
That's true.